the graphing method of the M and the B, which is the most preferred graphing method because it's the quickest and the easiest. Once you know your slope and your y-intercept, then that's all that you will use to graph the lines. Right? So this is the third method of graphing, and like I said, it is the one that you would probably prefer the most due to its efficiency. So before we fill in the chart and take a look at the graphs, the first thing I want to do over here on the right-hand side is give you the steps to graph in this way. That way, if you get lost, you have something to go back to and look at, and hopefully can figure out what's going on. Right? And this is only to use with the slope and y-intercept. So the first thing that you must do, if necessary, is to put the equation in intercept form. And again, that's on an as-needed basis. So in parentheses, I'm going to put if needed. If it's already there, you don't have to worry about it. But if it isn't, you have to make that your first move. Once you've put your equation in intercept form, you're going to then, second step, identify the slope and y-intercept, because those are your two most important pieces to make the graph work. The third step that you're going to do is you're going to begin with the B. See, the word begin starts with a B, and so does the letter B. Right? So that would be your y-intercept. So you're going to plot your y-intercept on the y-axis. Okay, you always start with the y-intercept. Don't ever start with anything else. Right? And then after you have that first point, you will need to do 2 more points after that. And to get the other 2 points, we're going to use the slope to help us do this. So from the y-intercept, use rise over run for the slope to get your other points. And remember that you need to have at least 3 points on your line before you can connect it and say you're done. Right? This method requires 3 and tables require 3, but x and y intercepts only require 2. So if we take a look at the equations in the chart, we want to first make sure that it's in intercept form or put it there, and then identify the slope and the y-intercept. Remember, slope is your letter M and y-intercept is your letter B, and slope-intercept form is that equation or formula y equals mx plus b. And once we have all these information pieces filled in the chart, then we can go to the grids below, and I'll show you how easy it is to graph from just the 2 numbers that you have present. So for letter A, intercept form, it's already there. So I'm simply going to write it again, y equals 3x plus 1. I don't need to do anything to it because the y is already by itself. From this, I can pick out the m and the b. The m is 3 and the b is positive 1. If you go to letter B, again, it's already solved for y, so we're good to go. Y equals negative x plus 2. Because of the number in front of the x, the slope would be a negative 1, and your b would be a positive 2. If you go to letter C, you'll notice the y is not by itself, but we have one thing we can do and it'll be ready to go. So if you subtract your 2x from both sides, you are now going to have y equals negative 2x plus 6, and it's in the correct format. In front of your x is the slope, which is negative 2, and your b is the positive 6. When you go to letter D, the y is already by itself, but you can't leave it with a math problem over top of one single number. You physically have to share the denominator with each part of the top. So if I rewrite this, it is going to say y equals 1/2 x, because x over 2 is the same thing as 1/2 x, plus 3 over 2. Okay, so if it helps you, if you look underneath, we're going to split it up to say x over 2 plus 3 over 2. And that's what will turn into 1/2 x plus 3/2. So your slope is 1/2 and your y-intercept is 3/2. When you get to letter E, it's already ready to go in intercept form, so y equals negative 3. Because there's no x present, then that must mean that your slope is 0, and the negative 3 that is there is representing your y-intercept. If you go to letter F, we have to get the y by itself, so we've got a few steps to do on this one. First thing you want to do is subtract 2x from both sides. So now you have negative 4y equals negative 2x plus 16. Divide everybody by negative 4 and clean it up. So now you've got y equals positive 1/2 x minus 4. And from this equation, your slope is 1/2 and your y-intercept is negative 4. Now using only the slope column and the y-intercept column, because that's all I'm going to need, I can graph all 6 of these lines and graph them accurately and be done. It is that simple to do once you have those 2 numbers. So for letter A, I'm going to graph the first line on the grid that says letter A beside it. You are instructed to now plot the y-intercept on the y-axis, so you begin with the b. So I have a positive 1 as my b. So on my y-axis, I go to positive 1, and that's my starting point. I now need to get 2 more dots from this. In order to get the dots, you're going to need to take your slope, which in our case is a 3, and turn it into a fraction, because you have to have a rise and a run. So when it's a whole number, you just stick a 1 on the bottom. So I'm going to rise 3, and I'm going to run 1. But pay attention, if it's positive, you're going up. If it's a positive run, you're going to the right. So in this case, I'm going to rise 3, and I'm going to run 1 to the right. Put a dot. Do it again. From that dot, rise 3 more, and run 1 to the right. Now I have 3 dots on my grid. I'm going to take my straight edge. Don't freehand these. Use a straight edge to be accurate. And do put arrows at the end because you are graphing lines. Okay, so you've just graphed that equation just from 2 values. So let's try the next one. Start at the b on the y-axis, so I'm going to go to positive 2 and make my starting point. My slope is negative 1, but I got to make that into a fraction, so I'm going to put a 1 on the bottom. So my rise is negative 1, and my run is positive 1. When your rise is negative, you're not really going up, you're actually falling down. Okay, so instead of going up, you're going to go down 1. I'm going to go down 1, my run is positive, so I'm still going to go to the right. Anytime you have a positive run, you go to the right. So it's down 1 and right 1. Put your dots, connect them with your straight edge, and you've just graphed that equation. So it's very easy to do and very quick to do once you know what to do with those 2 numbers. For letter C, my slope is negative 2 and my y-intercept is positive 6. So begin at the 6 on the y-axis. There it is. Your slope is negative 2. It's not a fraction, so I'm going to stick a 1 on it. I'm going to rise negative 2 and run positive 1. So because I'm rising negative 2, I'm technically going to go down 2 and right 1. Down 2 and right 1. You should always check behind yourself, because if your line is negative, or your slope is negative, your line should have a negative slope to it. It should be going downhill. If your slope is negative and you're graphing something and it goes uphill, you know you did something wrong. Okay, so double check behind yourself and make sure that those points aren't going to be lost because of that carelessness. Now for letter D, it's a little tricky because you have a fraction in both places. Right? The slope is not a bad deal. It's the fraction in the y-intercept that makes it a little harder. These grids are very small, so we have to be careful with our fractions. 3/2 is the same thing as 1/2. So we need to start on our y-axis at the value 1/2, which is hard to do sometimes when you have a tiny grid. Okay, so do the best you can. So 1/2 is literally in between 1 and 2. Right? So from that, my slope is 1/2. I don't have to worry about making it a fraction. It already is 1. So when I rise 1 and run 2, I've got to make sure that it's whole units. So when I rise 1 whole unit, I'm not going to rise to the next line because that's not a whole unit. That's half a unit. I want to rise to the middle of the next line, and then I want to run over 2. So for this graph, you're going to have your dots in the middle of the grid rather than in the corners of the grid. So it's a little trickier to graph. Most of the ones that I give you, if not all of them, there will not be a fraction in the y-intercept spot. Okay, so just be careful. For letter E, the slope is 0 and the y-intercept is negative 3. So on the y-axis, go to negative 3 and put your first dot. If your slope is 0, when you make it a fraction, you put a 1 on the bottom. Rise 0, run 1. So I'm just going to keep running because I'm not rising at all. And if I run, all I'm going to end up having eventually is a horizontal line. And you should recall from class that when you have 0 slope, it is going to be a horizontal line anyway. Okay. For letter F, we want to start at negative 4 on the y-axis. And our slope is already a fraction. It's 1/2, so I'm going to rise 1 and run 2. So up 1, right 2, up 1, right 2. Use your straight edge and connect. Don't forget your arrows. Okay, so I have done the first 6 with you. Your job is going to be to flip your paper over and to try the next 5 on your own. Make sure that you put them in intercept form first, identify the slope and the y-intercept second, and then use those 2 numbers to graph. Right? So together in class, we'll see how you did on those 5 once you get the practice going.